welcome to Word and Words. I'm joined by Andrew Noble, and Phil is ideally en route to the podcast, and we wanted to talk today a little bit about vibe shifts. There's been some talk over the past few years of this criteria of like a neutral world, a positive world, and a negative world. I'm not entirely convinced that it's useful as a general description of culture. I think it's actually more balkanized than that. There's regions everywhere where you'll sometimes still have this highly positive world towards Christianity, sometimes negative, sometimes neutral. I think if you look at U.S. politics in particular, there's a resurgence of maybe a positive view of Christianity. Anyway, all that to say is I think it's an interesting discussion because the even if we don't necessarily agree on this as a universal description, it still is worth pondering because we do live in a world that is entirely different than it used to be 20 odd years ago. Hi, Phil. We already started the podcast and we're recording, so we'll turn to you first to be able to answer the question that you missed.
All
right, just kidding. Andrew, why don't you just give me your kind of your hot take on the terminology of the threefold world in which we live in as a culture descriptor?
Well, I appreciated your hesitancy with endorsing all of it. I'm curious for Phil to describe exactly what a negative world is, because I know he's done more reading on that than me, maybe. But I find some people are very hesitant in the conversation, and they may be more on the theological side. So they kind of are like, there's nothing new under the sun, according to Ecclesiastes. What are the trends? There is no such thing as trends. There's just a sinful world with common grace in it, that sort of thing. And there's going to be ebbs and flows in different directions. And then there's the other side that kind of really enjoys some of the upticks on this, or, there's been a few things that have happened at the beginning of 2025. Reports of YouVersion had its most downloads in a day ever. There's talk of Bible sales being at an all-time high. So that's on the Christianity side. And then you have someone like Joe Rogan inviting Wes Huff, fellow Canadian, onto his podcast. And you saw an actual orthodox approach to Christianity defended on the most popular podcast. And so there seems to be a vibe shift in relation to Christianity. And some people also see a vibe shift in relation to social conservative / Christian values. So maybe Meta, maybe out of the Donald Trump election, Zuckerberg seems maybe out of self-interest for his own company's sake to just align with the government. They're going to align with some of Trump's rhetoric. Trump's billboard in Florida was like, we're going to make things happen for you. Whereas Biden and their administration, they're going to make things happen for they, them. This contrast between the woke and the anti-woke, and maybe there is this anti-woke rise. So I think in approaching this conversation, I appreciate the theology that kind of puts limits on the extent to which we get excited or not excited about some of these vibe shifts. But I also want to give attention to the fact that there are some differences in culture, and we need to, I believe, appropriately speak into that culture, and recognize that some people get caught up in it, and therefore I think it's helpful as Christian leaders and thinkers and writers to articulate what's going on in the world and therefore how to respond to it, because there does need to be a different word to Athens than Egypt. So yeah, I don't know if that's hot enough for a take, but Phil, I'll pass it to you because you can maybe educate me on what negative world means, because I've heard a lot of different people talk about it, and I know Aaron Renz, like that original essay birthed it all. But do you still hold to us being into a negative world despite all these vibe shifts?
Yeah, I think it's a great way to think about it. And I think Aaron Wren, when you read him directly and not so much the people commenting on his ideas, like I've been reading his Substack for quite a while before he had that big article. And he's actually quite a responsible thinker, and he's circumspect in what he is claiming and isn't claiming. But you've seen this idea, I think, reverberate with a lot of people, and they caught on to it, and they interpreted it in all kinds of different ways. But I think if you go back to just the basic idea that there has been a substantive, discernible shift from what he called the positive world to neutral world to now negative world, I think it's pretty hard to disagree with the general thesis that he lays out. But at the same time, here we are now in early 2025, and we're all talking about the vibe shift and the new openness and the surprising rebirth of belief in God, according to the work of Justin Brierley, which I've been following closely. And that I track with all that. I think that's all legitimate. I do think that there's something significant going on. But how can both be true? Like if it's a negative world, then is that at odds with a sort of, what do we want to call it, like the first fruits of a revival, or just a renewed wave of spiritual interest? And I think the way to think of it is that the negative world describes a broader cultural attitude towards the claims of Christianity. And there is, in the reigning institutions of our societies in the West, we've seen I think a marked hostility, which was new, towards Christianity. And as James Wood has pointed out, and I think he's right on the money, and this is really interesting and important to remember, the particular points of disagreement and hostility are not Christianity's supernatural claims, right? It used to be like, oh, how can Christians claim to be the only way to heaven? That was seen as that's in our theology of the supernatural and of salvation.
Mm-hmm.
The issue now is our anthropology, is the Christian and biblical view of human beings and human sexuality and human sexual morality. This is seen as oppressive and horrible by some of these reigning institutions that have been captured by progressive ideology. Now, the vibe shift, I think, is there's kind of a populist rise and reaction to that progressive ideology, which was never really in line with reality. And I think there's just a lot of those seeds that they sowed are now, like, they're reaping the fruits of that. And so there's multiple things going on, and I think it is possible to harmonize them and make sense of them, and that's what I'm trying to do in my own thinking. But that's kind of the first sketch of how I would propose to do that.
So you'd say still a negative world. We're still in that kind of general over. And as Wyatt noted before you even joined the call, there are like exceptions to the rule. Because I think in Quebec, you're not going to have I'm sorry, but like 30 years ago in Quebec, was it really that different than today? Like in Quebec City doing evangelism, like maybe some differences, but it's not like there's evangelicals morality across the board in there. You know what I mean? Or even my own friends that are not Christian, like they're still materialists. When I talked to them a month or two ago, like it was like a materialist, they were imbibing that doctrine just as they were 10 years prior. So as much as there's this vibe shift and trends, like when you talk to an individual, sometimes they don't align with, or if you're in a particular place in Canada or America or wherever in the world, and often this negative world is just the West. But yeah, I always want to add some of those caveats because it's kind of like the worldview problem where everybody just wants to have one worldview to ascribe to their opponent, and then here's how you critique it, and that's all you need to do. That's simple apologetics, which isn't, I think, as helpful as having some more nuance. So Wyatt, are you seeing...
Those nuances are necessary. Those are all very good points and valid. Quebec is a different cultural situation. We can get into that if you want, but it's always been a little different than the rest of Canada or the United States.
Yeah.
So yeah, for sure. And each individual is an individual. And you can find individuals who believe all kinds of things regardless of what's going on in the wider culture. And that's always very important to remember. Yeah.
Yeah, so I do think the terminology can be useful, and it's undoubtedly true that from 50 years ago in Anglo North America, culture has shifted. whether or not it's more antagonistic against Christianity per se, I'm not sure, but it's certainly more permissive morally. The assumptions are no longer that Christianity promotes in terms of morality are no longer shared with the culture. It's not normal to go to church on Sunday as it used to be for many people. Maybe on holidays, people still go on Easter and Christmas, but increasingly that sort of like cultural Christianity is on the decline. And cultural Christianity for me is essentially pre-evangelism, is the ability to know right from wrong, the general morality and order of truth to things, so that when people do realize that they are sinners, they know the answer intuitively already, and we can be there to minister. But the loss of cultural Christianity is a great loss for evangelism and a great loss for the church, because we have to now deconstruct an entire order of imagination before we can reconstruct the cathedral of Christianity in their minds and hearts. That's not easy. That takes lifelong discipleship. Sometimes you read these stories in the early church and you're like, why did it take them like 10 or 20 years to get right? It's because they didn't have cultural Christianity yet. So the loss of that, I think, is going to elongate the time it will take to disciple someone. And we will continue to find Christians doing surprisingly immoral things, because they've essentially recreated the cathedral over a decade. You know, I think of Clement writing in the 90s to the Corinthian church, complaining that they're still doing the same things that Paul told them to stop doing. And I think deconstructing paganism and reconstructing Christianity is a group project, a theological cultural project, and a church-wide project that can take a long time. So I think we're going to be surprised. You still have this older generation who gets surprised when like a Gen Z does something immoral. They're like, how could they possibly not wear a suit on Sunday or whatever it is? And I think part of that is they're living in two worlds. The world of cultural Christianity that was very, very good, and the world in which that is gone and is very, very bad. And therefore there's it takes a longer time for discipleship to take hold in hearts.
So you're like, I like, one of the things that interests me is, okay, what changes from a church perspective in terms of, I've heard some people say that Alpha ministries, they're not as effective anymore. We need to start doing something different. Alpha was effective 10, 15 years ago, but now it's more slow. It's more community based. The missional movement was kind of bringing some of this stuff up. So what do you think Wyatt churches should be doing? And maybe because what I hear you saying is that it's kind of going to be slow. We can't just expect a few podcasts in order to like convert a bunch of people. You're kind of tempering some of the excitement around any vibe shift that might seem to be in Christians' favor.
Yeah, I think there's going to be obviously miraculous works of God that go against all of our expectations. I'm not at all denying any of God can do great things and does. I think we need tempered expectations about the length and length of time it'll take and the amount of work that it'll involve to disciple people who have spent 27 years believing in an entirely different moral, religious, and theological perspective. That you come to Christianity, it's people sometimes have this where they're like, okay, can I do this anymore? Is it right to wear this kind of clothing? Or like, should I, can I get drunk? Like all that kind of standard stuff that's more based on our sort of Anglo culture, Franco-Anglo culture. But I think now that if you're born in like 2010 and you're whatever 15-ish today, 14, 15, you've lived in a world in which there's just entirely different categories for everything. And your moral and theological framework, and you do have one, is of such a sort that you're going to be like the Corinthians, and that's just fine. We need to realize that we're in a Corinthian ministry world, and have excessive patience. What it requires, however, I think, is a return to simplicity of moral instruction. In the 80s and 90s, we could say, like, don't be a moralist, just preach the gospel because everyone knows what is right, more or less. No, they don't anymore. We need to be moralists. We need tons of moralism. tons of concrete talk about what it actually means to control your sexuality, your lusts and desires, tons of rules and regulations, not really, but tons of habits of the mind. We need to be excessive moralists. We need to do moral preaching. We need people to know what is right and wrong about everything. And we need to tell people that the law is fulfilled in us through Christ, yes, and the Spirit, but you need to know what it is, and we need to equip you to know what it is. That's hugely important. Our apologetic witness is deeply harmed because of the excessive sin of our leaders who don't even know the basic norms of morality.
Right.
Because they just say, well, Christ saves you. Who cares if you do the right thing? I don't know. Because maybe that you shouldn't pervert the grace of God, as Jude says, for your evil lifestyle. So I think that's going to be hugely important. I think secondly, and that's the last thing I'll say on this topic, is we need, I think Wes Huff, who, Andrew, I think someone mentioned him, showed us that we need to know stuff. We don't know stuff anymore. We don't know anything. We don't know anything about manuscripts. We don't know anything about like theology, church history. We just don't know stuff, and we think Alpha is going to fix it. It's not. Alpha works, I think, in the positive world, and everyone kind of knows the framework. We need to tell people the 10 Commandments. We need to tell them that you should be married before you have sex. We need to tell them that you shouldn't masturbate because that's wrong. We need to tell them that you should only use social media in this way. We need to tell people exactly what to do with full-orbed moralism, with extra energy, because evil is evil and good is good. And then we need to, I think, tell people that you need to know stuff. Like, hey, these are the names of the apostles. This is Jesus. And hey, Christianity is a historical religion. We have like Bibles and things, and teach people the rudiments based on deep knowledge.
Good stuff, Wyatt. Yeah, I've definitely felt that over time. My own journey is going from a non-denominational church to a Baptist church where Bob McGregor, I remember the first few Sundays hearing him preach, and he would be very clear about moral issues in our day. And it almost shocked me because the church I was at before, it just was not as clear. It was kind of assumed there'd be like a broad category of like, and I know it's hard in a culture where sexual ethics are questioned, but we need to hold fast to the truth. But then there was no specifics. And you know, like, it's like, well, what do you mean by Christian ethics? And I think we are in a culture where we need to be more clear about this kind of stuff. Like, I recently had a conversation with someone where they basically were like understanding themselves as a Christian, but they didn't want to enforce their Christianity on others, right? They didn't want to, we can't tell others, you know, what, you know, and it's just like this idea of like freedom or norms according to the human life. And it's like what you're saying about we live in a culture and you don't realize how antagonistic it is towards Christianity.
Before Phil answers, I just want to clarify, I wasn't arguing that we enforce we can't. I was arguing that we uphold these things as good and right because they are, and people know exactly where the target is given what God requires of us. Because
Phil had some concern on his face.
Well, I just thought as the, you know, executive director of Grace to You Canada, it's a bit surprising to hear such a full-throated endorsement of moralistic preaching, you know, which has kind of been the bugbear that TPC
I'm not Grace to You, by the way, but go ahead.
Oh, did I say Grace to You?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I meant to say gospel.
Yeah. Gospel.
I meant to say gospel.
I'm the editor. Yeah.
Yeah. So, like, you know, but it's interesting how you're framing that. I think, you know, the concern for allowing moralism to obscure the gospel is an evergreen concern. But you're right that in a culture that is as morally confused, and not just confused, but like has no reference points left, has no foundation or anchor points from which to build or to reason, we do need the kind of foundation building that you're advocating. And I think that's partially why myself and my wife have been so drawn to teaching on the virtues. Like, we didn't have really a clear sense of virtues before. Growing up, it was just like, well, godliness and ungodliness. But like the idea of moral virtues, character virtues that we can that we can work on in our own lives and instill in our children, that's separate from the gospel, is still like these things belong together, not pitted against each other.
That's right.
And I think the church evangelistically was like, we gotta shy away from moralizing people and just give them that sweet gospel. And it's like, okay, you need to be crystal clear on the gospel, what it is and what it isn't. And then you need really thorough moral formation and teaching. And teaching people the shape of the moral universe that God designed, the objective morality that is, that every human is going to be held accountable to. So
That's right.
so it's good. I want to say something else too, like um, the the vibe shift. I think, for me, I do see, I do think that there's something really legitimate going on. You had the thing at Asbury, um, with the seemingly kind of spiritual outpouring there, and then you have stuff online, and you have West going on Joe Rogan. But beyond that, like in my own local church ministry in the last 2 years, there's just been so many people just walking in our doors looking. They just Googled churches, and they've just had stuff happening in their lives, God moving in their
Mm,
lives, drawing them, and they're coming, and it's like they're they're so primed. It's like, just tell, like, I know I need this. I know I'm being drawn to this. Just tell me what the deal is, and I'm in. So
that's right.
it's it's really remarkable, and that's not something that I've seen in previous years. And so, to me, that really dovetails with what seems to be happening on a broader cultural level with these high-profile conversions, which I think are emblematic of, as a culture. And this is where I would say what you said about cultural Christianity is well taken. But on the flip side of that, I would say, as thoughtful people really glimpse what a world without cultural Christianity looks like, they realize how much I want actually what cultural Christianity gives, and I'm curious in a new way as to how we got that. And the roots of that go all the way back into the very pages of the New Testament and the life, death,
That's right.
resurrection of
Well,
Jesus.
wisdom is proved by her children. And as one anonymous author wrote in the probably early 100s to Diognetus, the church is the soul. It's like the soul to the body. It's the life of the world. And I think we're beginning to
Mm,
realize that. And my comment
mm,
before is, so we need Christ-centered preaching, but when everyone knows what is right, if you focus on moralism, you're going to make them think that they're saved by their works or saved by their goodness. But when nobody knows what is right, you need moralism to give them the foundation, like the Ten Commandments, for example. Uh, and then you need to preach Christ like crazy. It's at both ends. I think the vibe shift means that people don't know that stealing is wrong. So you got to tell them that. And so once they know that, then you're not talking about them being saved by not stealing. It's not even on the category. It's just don't do evil. That's what I'm getting at. And then your salvation, your life is entirely rooted in the gospel of Jesus Christ. So I think that's also important. In terms of cultural Christianity, I think you're right. I think wisdom is proved by our children, but those who are reflecting on the loss of cultural Christianity, like the Dawkins and so on, are, I think, evincing the importance of it, namely that we are the life of the world. I mean, John 1:9, I think, says that Christ, the Word of God, illuminates every single human being. And as we cast the light of the goodness of God and Christ on the world around us, it does have this illuminating, enlightening, not in the Buddhist sense, but in the enlightening sense on the world. We are that light on the hill that shines down. We are the salt of the earth. We are the soul of the body, the life of the world. And as that draws away, we increasingly are going to balkanize, I think, into pre-Christian morality, which is not good. And so hopefully people recognize that, but if we lose it, it's still not good. It's not good because it's evil.
yeah, yeah, I think that's correct. And I've been thinking through, C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man. I know you recently looked at it as well and did a video on it. I just started reading Michael Ward's book After Humanity, which is kind of a detailed discussion and exploration of that short text. And, in there, Lewis talks about how as we lose objective morality, we step out into the void. And
Mm.
he sees it as this radical departure from even the paganism that preceded Christianity. And I've been really thinking about that and wrestling through that, because we often talk about our culture as repaganizing. And there's a sense, of course, in which that's true. And I'm trying to just parse some of these ideas, because something about what Lewis says is really interesting. He has this, let's say, a threefold distinction between pre-Christian paganism and then Christianity, kind of, in his view, in Chesterton, fulfills the best of paganism
Mhm.
and really erases paganism from the world in a way. And I think that has to be qualified, because we do find animism in all kinds of places. But when you preach the gospel to those places, it's often received as a kind of fulfillment and a completion of, let's say, the best elements of it. But then there's like a demonic aspect of paganism, which,
That's right.
we don't want to gloss over. And you think about Carthage, you think about Moloch, you think about all these horrid ways. And some writers tend to focus only on that, so that paganism is just another word for moral evil or moral subjectivism. There's some confusion there, and I'm trying to parse through it. But how do you sort of think through those categories, applying it to what we've just been discussing with, what people are calling the vibe shift?
Well, I think the big theological picture is that God made a world that is discernible and understandable and has laws of cause and effect. What goes up must come down. You plant something and water it, it grows. And so part of God's restraining of our sin and guiding us is through this natural order of things. Genesis says the sun, moon, and stars are for signs and seasons. So when it comes to paganism, there's so much that they're going to observe about stars, about agriculture, horticulture, brain surgery now. All of that I think we can see. And then also some of the virtues that come through that, like the virtues of hard work and diligence. There's nothing there to say that we can't see what is good, because it is good. God created everything to be very good, even human beings. And though sin corrupts humanity, there are still these glimmers of, okay, you help someone cross the street who needed help with their groceries. That's good. And you'll see this even in paganism as well. So insofar as that common good, that sort of natural good is sort of there, great. But ultimately, the choices of people are so marred, I think, by the corruption of sin, that you need the illuminating presence of Holy Scripture and then the renovating presence of the Spirit to not only clarify truth to the utmost, but also to carry out truth to the fullest. So for me, there are so many. There's the rich bounty of the pagans, which is, I think, Herman Bavinck says something to that degree. The rich wealth, or whatever it is. Yeah, we look at that. When it comes to, like, if you're going to go to college, you're going to read a textbook on science and philosophy and brain surgery and whatever else by non-Christians, because they genuinely can know truth and know things. Insofar as it comes to ultimate things, though, I think we have to be much more careful. Worship. All the things the Bible reveals, it reveals to us, namely about God, Trinity, and Christ, the cross, atonement, because it is inaccessible, at least fully in any way, in nature. And we need that to cast a light on what humans create based on what they know that they need deep in their hearts, because we're all restless. So we create gods in our imagination, and Paul lists them in Romans 1, four-footed animals, etc. So that's kind of how I would go about it. I think good to learn, but good to have lots of Bible as your ammunition as you're learning. I think Andrew has left, and we were
We
agreeing
lost
to
Andrew.
finish around this time. I'm wondering if you might want to say a final thing that we might. I think what we have to do is just both hit leave, because I can't stop the recording because he started it.
Okay, all right. Well, let's see if we can figure that out. So, in summation, one thing that has been a part of my own thinking and writing over the last number of years is the sense in which the move from reductive materialism or atheism to a kind of paganism or reenchantment is is a kind of recovery of some metaphysical truth.
Mm.
And it's like a step in the right direction. And I think that dovetails with what Lewis argues. He says, you leave objective morality behind, you step out into the void. And I think people are stepping out of the void towards the light by saying there's something more than mere matter. And some of those people are following the breadcrumbs all the way to Christ and the cross. And I've been concerned with trying to explore that and celebrate that and also help the church find ways to facilitate that journey out of this controlling paradigm of reductive materialism towards a discovery of everything that doesn't fit within there, all the mystery and wonder and miracles of the world, and then ultimately to Christ, who is the source of all. So, the vibe shift, I think, dovetails into that. I think the negative world is kind of a separate cultural conversation that we discussed earlier. But all these things fit together, and they're very fascinating elements of our contemporary moment. And I think the takeaway for Christian leaders and churches is keep doing the simple good things. I think some of these elements that we talked about, the thoroughgoing moral teaching, that's so important. And work hard to be a place where people that God is drawing to himself can find genuine, spirit-filled Christian community, clarity on the gospel, and good moral teaching. And I think that if the church can do that, we've gone a long way to being what God calls us to be.